Greetings, scholars, and welcome to the Gothic era. The period here ranges from the 12th century, 1100s, to the 15th century, 1400s. And remember that periods are marked by changes in style and technology. So the vagueness of dates is because not everyone, everywhere shifts to the new style immediately or has developed, traded, obtained the technology. So in one region, like France, you might be leading the Gothic style movement decades or even a century before others catch up to their knowledge, techniques, or tastes. Then another movement takes over, and there's pockets of regions that maintain the Gothic style or techniques for decades, or again, maybe a century after everyone else has moved on. So dates are not based on somebody's birthday or the election of a new XYZ, but rather marked by usage of ideas, styles, technologies, etc. Another note, Goths did not build the Gothic cathedral. The Gothic period is late medieval term to refer to the time before the Renaissance. So the Goths sacked Rome a few hundred years earlier, and the classicists, who think Greece and Rome were the coolest thing ever, used the term Gothic as sort of an insult to the style movement that did not mimic the early classical Greek and Roman periods. In fact, the medieval period, often called the Dark Ages, but not in this house, was a great moment for true discovery and innovation. The Renaissance means rebirth, which means rediscovering the knowledge of the past, the Greeks and the Romans, the classical period. The Middle Ages was one time of new and different innovation. So yes, classical Roman ideas were abandoned, but learning and discovering still continued in many ways. We're going to look at cathedrals. There are marvels of mathematical innovation in a way never seen before. The pointed arch, the flying buttress, these rib vaults to be able to have stone ceilings that are thin and high. The idea that the Gothic era was dark or ignorant is absolutely going to be dispelled today. Again, not in this house. Because not only do we have innovation and risk-taking in our architectural and geometric construction methods, but also it's literally the ability with the Gothic cathedrals to be able to build with light. Gothic innovation took risks and relied on advanced theories in geometry to build to huge heights, relying on a skeleton of structure built from stone and then just empty space that could be filled with glass, another technology that brings light in this period. So buildings were built higher than ever before, and they brought light inside with this new airy construction. And while we have another lecture on the architecture, today we're going to be talking about the art that accompanied this period of sort of amazing innovation. I'm going to make a big statement right now. The Gothic cathedral race across Europe was the last great, truly new race of innovation and technology until the 20th century space race. They were brave, they took risks, made mistakes, caused disasters, but made leaps and bounds in the advancement of technology, exploration, understanding in a short window of time. The first kind of art that I want to touch on briefly, because I've got some really cool videos for you in your course folder on how the colored stained glass was manufactured in the medieval period. But this idea that we can draw with panels of glass as these color washes built between lead I-beams creates this ability to fill in huge spaces with beautiful light casting color and tell stories without needing to necessarily be able to read. So oftentimes they were much more than decoration. They were also education. So what we have here is the Cathedral of Saint Denis Jesse tree. And the Jesse tree is the genealogy of Jesus. showing the direct descent from Joseph from the Old Testament King David. So though Jesus was born of a virgin birth, as in Joseph had no input in the conception, it legitimates why this particular couple, Mary and Joseph in particular, were chosen to receive and raise the Christ child. While Joseph wasn't his father, he was his dad. And it brings Joseph in as an important character as this descendant of the great King David. From a genre, media, technique perspective, as we get into critiquing this art, notice how we have outline. It is very sort of coloring book like in how the art is presented. And that is by design. That is part of the technology that is stained glass, because each of those panels is a solid piece of glass that are held together in this puzzle between tiny pieces of I-beamed lead. So by the nature of the medium of stained glass, we have this outlined sort of composition. For some context, I've got a photograph from inside the Cathedral of Saint Denis so that you can see our point of view on these works would be absolutely worm's eye. The point of these massive cathedrals with these tall constructions and this wonderful light coming in through the stained glass, you feel small. Even in our modern age of skyscrapers and technologies that these people couldn't dream of, when you walk into a Gothic cathedral, you still feel small. Because even in our age of skyscrapers, we don't tend to leave a 5 or 12-story tall ceiling. You feel small. In this era, life was difficult for most people. And so to have sort of a dark, dirty, difficult daily life and once a week come to a space like this that feels magical and huge can make you feel like part of something bigger than yourself, more meaning to your life than just your own wants and needs and desires. And I think that that is still something that these spaces offer people even today. And the art, the stained glass, has a lot to do with that environment, that feeling that we get in these spaces. Art tended to serve the architecture during this period. So the stained glass fits in those spaces, is shaped like the pointed arches to fit in those spaces between pillars in the architecture. The mural is built within the constraints of the space between the arches. So the art is decorating the architecture, and it's also constrained by the priority of the architecture. So that fresco is wet paint applied to wet plaster directly on the wall. What that does for us, as far as this technique, is that there's a depth to a fresco. That paint gets soaked into the wet plaster for some space, and it makes it more scratch resistant, because if it gets scuffed on the surface, that pigment has soaked in deeper, it's not going to remove the image. And it also keeps the pigments looking very vibrant. They don't fade as much because light is literally not penetrating the entire depth of the pigment. So it is a method of mural painting that lasts for centuries. This piece here is the Triumph of St. Thomas Aquinas in 1365 by Andrea di Buonaiuto, as in good help. It's at the Church of Santa Maria Novella in Florence, Italy. And it is just a great example of this medieval fresco painting. Note our symmetry here is very vertical, and you kind of got that up and down, and it's split right down the center. If you drew a vertical line, it's very even, very balanced, almost exactly balanced, where if you've got a person on this side, a person on that side, 2, 2, 3, 3. So it's very, very symmetrical. The poses are still fairly stiff and rigid, but we've got some more naturalistic poses amongst the people down at the bottom. And usually the lowest people to be painted tend to be the highest people in the community or the people who commissioned the artwork. But above them, we have the saints with their halos there and the angels floating above them, and St. Thomas Aquinas there throned in the center, holding open, presumably, the Bible. And so with this work, we are seeing that iconic use of stiffness and rigidity in poses because our saints and our Holy Family and Christ and angels, we want them to be forever unchanging. Life is full of change and disappointment until we live to death. And also good things. I'm not trying to be a downer, but this idea that mortality means that we are ever changing, whereas your eternal spiritual leaders need to be there always. So this idea of that iconic vertical symmetry, we call it iconic because the religious icons tend to be presented as unmoving, unchanging, and therefore stable and reliable. And that's something you want in your religious figures. It's also something you want in your politics. Nobody wants the chaos of overthrow. Nobody wants the chaos of an ill, dying, changing, moving, running leader. So you will often see in political images this vertical symmetry and these sort of stiff, very symmetrical poses. Down at the bottom, we have the people. Certainly, they are the patrons of this art, but they are also standing for the mortals down on earth, sort of lower down. And they have more dynamic poses, not by much, but by medieval standards, they certainly have more naturalistic, comfortable, asymmetrical, casual poses because life is change and movement. So we have that sort of rigid cast of characters above for their static appearance. And then we have those more relaxed, moving, changing mortals down below. Also note that we have not very much of an attempt, but a tiny amount of attempt at creating a sense of three-dimensional depth on this flat two-dimensional wall. So you have certainly people, shapes overlapping down in the bottom section. And you also have a floor moving backwards and up above where the saints are sitting. And so we get a small attempt at creating at least a shallow illusion of three-dimensional depth on this flat 2D plane. So we're moving towards that idea of creating that three-dimensional illusion of space on the flat 2D picture plane. Sculpture. Even sculpture was there to serve the architecture during the medieval period. And here we have portal statues. Portal is just a word for door. So these are statues that are built around the doors at the entrance of the cathedral. So once again, we are back at Saint Denis, and that is just my bad French for Saint Denis. And we have our Saint Denis, and you know who he is because he is the fellow wearing the bishop's hat, holding his own head. The story goes that Denis was the Bishop of Paris who was beheaded by a Roman emperor during the persecution of Christians around 250 AD on Montmartre Hill. And Montmartre is just the hill of the martyrs. And the martyrs would be these persecuted Christians. So the kind of cool, artsy neighborhood in Paris is still named after this persecution of the Christians by the Romans in 250 AD. And when Denis, the bishop, was beheaded, it said that he picked up his head and he walked for several miles with his severed head in his hands, preaching about penitence, talking the whole time. And when his body finally collapsed, that was the site where they built the modern cathedral in his name, in his honor, Saint Denis in Paris. So these portal statues, they are tall and skinny. They mimic the pillars in their shape. And that is a little bit stylistic, but at the same time, it's pragmatic because you've got this space that is tall and slim that needs to be filled around these door frames, or at least could be filled with decorations such as these statues. Speaking of decorative, functional, serves the architecture sculptures, boy, howdy, are you going to know the difference between a gargoyle and a chimera by the end of this course. So, a gargoyle, which you see one here on Bern Cathedral in Switzerland, it is an architectural feature that is functional. So the gargoyle, he is a little monster and he's strangling a mermaid, poor dear. But the point that makes him a gargoyle isn't his monsterness, it is the fact that he is actually a decorative water spout. He is a gutter spout. So, gargoyle has to functionally spit water away from the foundation of the building. Remember, we're building bigger, higher, taller stone buildings during this period that are heavier than anything built before. And so, water up against a foundation can cause damage the building. So, moving water away from the foundation, we still do it today. Your house probably has gutters, and those gutters have gutter spouts that tend to be at least a foot or so long that push that water away from just running down the side of the foundation of the building. So a gargoyle is a decorative gutter spout. And what about other monsters that aren't gutter pipes? We call those chimera. I know that these are lovingly known as the gargoyles of Notre Dame in Paris, but they are the chimera, technically, of Notre Dame. You will know the difference. These are easy points on every test, and you can be that guy at cocktail parties from now on. You're welcome. We've talked a lot about the architecture and how art tended to serve the architecture. Public art that is in these buildings, such as cathedrals, where people gathered. The other, besides very, very public art that is serving architecture, is very, very private art. And that comes in these nifty things that we call books. And books, kind of a new concept after we've moved from scrolls to books, certainly a few centuries old by this point. But when we have these manuscripts, they are called illuminated manuscripts, or literally light up books in this period. And the illuminations are these decorations. So sometimes you have scroll work and just sort of decorative fancies that fill any blank spaces on the page. Other times you've got larger images that serve as educational. They have to do with what you are seeing in the text. So like illustrations today would be accompanying the text in a book. But many times certainly the margin illuminations or marginalia are just decorative, sometimes often silly nonsense. This one's pretty tame, and this is from the Aragon Nativity Illumination. I have a separate lecture that is all about this marginalia in medieval manuscripts and how bananas they can get. But just this idea that art is moving from the very large, very public, serving architecture, to the very small, very private, but in this case, serving the text. So art is kind of a backup singer in service to the great technologies of architecture and book text during this period.